Hello, my name is Patrick Hopkinson, and I'm the author of the Frank, Paul and William Safeguarding Adults Thematic Review, which was commissioned by the Brighton and Hove Safeguarding Adults Board and was published in 2025. Frank, Paul and William were referred separately to the Safeguarding Adults Board between February 2022 and January 2024. And it was decided that the key themes in their cases mirrored one another and that their deaths should be considered in a single review. The purpose of this review was to identify the lessons to be learned from their deaths and to apply those lessons to future cases to try and prevent similar harm from occurring. There were several similarities in the personal characteristics and wider circumstances of Frank, Paul and William. All three were white British men who were aged in their 40s and 50s when they died, and all were residing in either local authority or housing association accommodation. Frank, Paul and William all had a history of substance use, and each had experienced exploitation, with cuckooing as a specific concern. All three were self-neglecting, and agencies struggled to engage with them. There were, however, differences in the circumstances of Frank, Paul and William, including their cause of death, their diagnoses, and the extent to which they were isolated. However, all three men presented with a combination of physical, mental health and substance use related needs in addition to self-neglect, exploitation and contact with the criminal justice system. They are considered to have had multiple compound needs. And Frank, Paul and William's multiple compound needs crossed organisational and team boundaries to the extent that no single agency was able to appropriately meet all of their needs. Terms of reference were developed for the review, and these focused on the concerns identified by the Safeguarding Adults Board through the referrals that had been made. And those terms of reference included to consider whether Frank, Paul or William's multiple needs were recognised, whether there was professional curiosity, and whether trauma-informed approaches were used by single or multiple agencies, whether Frank, Paul and William's use of substances was considered and responded to, how repeated safeguarding concerns were approached, how cuckooing and self-neglect were identified and responded to, how the hospital discharge process for Frank and William worked, and how Paul and William's mental capacity was considered. I identified 5 distinct themes in the review based on the terms of reference and learning from the information provided by organisations involved and from an in-person learning event attended by practitioners from a wide range of services, and I'm going to take you through these one by one. The first theme was multi-agency working and the use of policies and procedures, including for discharge planning. And concerns were identified by the professionals who contributed to the review. And these included the difficulties for frontline professionals in retaining knowledge of both multiple policy documents and of the range of services operating locally. There was also a lack of confidence in challenging the decision-making of other agencies. And there was varying availability and willingness of services to participate in multi-agency and multidisciplinary meetings. But despite these concerns, the review found that a variety of relevant policies and procedures existed, and these were used by the organisations involved in this review. Overall, for Frank and Paul, the services engaged with them demonstrated that they worked together and shared information between each other and took personalised approaches to supporting both Frank and Paul. However, in Frank's case, there were examples of case closure due to difficulties engaging with Frank, but without consultation with other organisations which were already working with him. And in William's case, there was a pattern of repeated hospital admission followed by rapid self-discharge. And the discharge to assess process, which is a national model for the NHS, in which planning, assessment and arrangement of ongoing care takes place during the discharge to assess process rather than in hospital, did not result in services being provided to William. It's also unknown if attempts to engage William in the safeguarding process would have been successful, since no safeguarding enquiries were made prior to his death. The second theme was professional curiosity, flexibility, and the use of trauma-informed approaches. There were several key challenges to the ability of frontline workers to be professionally curious, because this requires sufficient time and flexibility, not only to carefully consider an individual's presenting circumstances, but also to appropriately question and challenge them when inconsistencies and contradictions arise. And this can be particularly challenging when, for example, an adult with care and support needs gives very reasonable or plausible explanations about why it's been hard to engage with them. Professionals can struggle to identify how much engagement is good enough for there not to be any red flags or concerns. And it can also be challenging to know what to do with the relevant information about a vulnerable adult when practitioners have been professionally curious, particularly if thresholds for safeguarding concerns or inquiries have not been met. And the review identified that there were some areas in which further curiosity into and consideration of Frank and Paul's circumstances could have been useful. For example, services found it challenging to engage both Frank and Paul. And in Frank's case, responsive services carers stopped visiting him. The St John's Ambulance Service continued to provide a daily telephone welfare check and would visit Frank if necessary. But there does not appear to have been consideration about how telephone contact may have created further barriers for Frank's engagement. And in Paul's case, he would maintain that he did not require support or interventions. However, a safeguarding concern that was submitted by a friend could have been an opportunity for a home visit to check on Frank's physical health, his living environment, and any further risks of cuckooing or exploitation. The third theme was adult safeguarding and self-neglect. Challenges identified by the practitioners participating in this review included that it can be difficult to identify when the refusal of support becomes self-neglect. And there can also be differing opinions across agencies of what a reasonable standard of self-care might look like. Safeguarding adult concerns were raised about Frank 4 times. They were raised 3 times for Paul and 5 times for William, with common shared concerns of exploitation and self-neglect present for all 3 men. Both Frank and Paul had declined safeguarding interventions, and William was not considered to have care and support needs at the time of his initial referral. And following further referrals, he died before a Section 42 safeguarding inquiry could be made. The Frank, Paul and William thematic review emphasises that Section 42 of the Care Act 2014 requires local authorities to make an adult safeguarding inquiry if they have a reasonable belief that an adult A has care and support needs, B is experiencing or is at risk of abuse or neglect, and C is unable to protect themselves as a result of their care and support needs. But the purpose of this criteria is not gatekeeping, and local authorities are not prevented from making safeguarding inquiries on another basis if the criteria are not met. Local authorities should also make an inquiry where a person is not at that moment being abused and neglected, but unless an intervention is made, they might be. And whilst adult safeguarding processes were followed, communication and partnership working could have been improved. The overall pattern of practice appears to have been to apply the statutory criteria in Section 42 of the Care Act 2014 without considering if other approaches, such as coordinating multi-agency meetings, may have been appropriate responses to the concerns. The fourth theme was cuckooing and responses to cuckooing. Professionals considered that there are some examples of excellent arrangements locally, including Operation Cuckoo, a multi-agency response to cuckooing coordinated by Sussex Police and involving Brighton and Hove City Council's social care and community safety teams, as well as housing providers and other relevant support services. And there is a strong network relationship between the participants in Operation Cuckoo, and the grading of referrals or the decision to close referrals altogether can only be undertaken collectively. However, practitioners also identified that not all agencies were aware of Operation Cuckoo. And Frank and Paul were both recognised as being vulnerable and at risk of cuckooing and exploitation, but both often denied this. In Frank's case, the police conducted 6 cuckooing-related welfare visits, and reports were shared with adult social care. But the police considered that there was no imminent or urgent risk, but prompt action was required. Paul was identified as a victim of county lines cuckooing when a known user of crack cocaine had entered his home, and there was evidence of multi-agency responses to concerns of cuckooing, including a joint visit to his home by the police and local authority housing services. The review noted that cuckooing can take many forms and is an area of safeguarding that may be unfamiliar to many people. And this may have contributed to concerns not being explored further by the Safeguarding Hub and Adult Social Care individually and jointly in Frank and Paul's case. The review explored multiple definitions of cuckooing outside of the most common definition, which is where a drug dealer or network takes over a vulnerable person's home to prepare, store or deal drugs, often via violent conduct or threats. And there is a need for knowledge, understanding of and training on cuckooing, and of the coercive and controlling behaviours that perpetrators may use. These may not only prevent their victim from escaping, but also may make it appear that their victim is culpable for and a willing participant in offences. The 5th theme was mental capacity and resources. It does not appear that Frank, Paul or William's mental capacity to make decisions about keeping themselves safe or about accepting care and support was assessed. And the provisions of the Mental Capacity Act 2005 can only apply to the decision-making of persons with an impairment or disturbance in the functioning of their mind or brain. And it appears that Frank, Paul and William all met this criteria. For example, Frank had mental health difficulties, Paul had autism and learning difficulties, and William had an acquired brain injury, which had required treatment in a rehabilitation centre. Frank, Paul and William also had histories of long-term substance use and of traumatic experiences. Frank and Paul were also known to have been exploited or cuckooed, and there had been an initial concern that William had been exploited. All these factors can cause an impairment in the functioning of the mind or brain. And the review also emphasises the importance of assessing mental capacity in the correct order, and that is that the functional test of whether a person can make a decision as defined in the Mental Capacity Act should come first. If the person is unable to make a decision, then the diagnostic test of whether the person has an impairment or disturbance in the functioning of their mind or brain should be made. The review identifies that mental capacity legislation and processes can be used to disrupt patterns of abuse. Because if a person is found to lack the mental capacity to make a specific decision, then decisions can be made on their behalf in their best interests, and an independent mental capacity advocate can be instructed to represent them. In situations where someone has been exploited or coerced or controlled by another person, these actions may break or at least weaken the power relationship by introducing new challenges that the perpetrator of abuse does not expect and is not prepared for. The review made 5 recommendations, and the first of these was that Brighton and Hove's Safeguarding Adults Board and partners should consider adapting, adopting or learning from alternative practice models in operation in other local authority areas. And the models, all of which are referenced and outlined in more detail in the review, provide examples of system change approaches for working with people whom agencies find it difficult to engage with and who experience risks of exploitation. And the second recommendation was that the Brighton and Hove Safeguarding Adults Board should lead the creation of networking and information sharing events so that practitioners across the organisations in this review can learn about each other's roles, their service offers and their eligibility criteria and ways of working. There should be a particular focus on the needs of people who self-neglect and who are difficult to engage with and are at risk from others. And the events may be an effective place to support a greater emphasis on multi-agency working. An online service directory could also be created. And the third recommendation was that Brighton and Hove Safeguarding Adults Board should increase the knowledge and awareness of Operation Cuckoo locally and of the valuable work being undertaken. And Sussex Police is in the process of leading a review of cuckooing policies and procedures, and this could include expanding the definition of cuckooing and of any associated practice guidance in line with the wider definition of cuckooing evidenced in the research outlined in this thematic review. And the fourth recommendation was that the Brighton and Hove Safeguarding Adults Board should seek assurance from partners that a trauma-informed and multi-agency approach to sharing information and raising concerns is being embedded in learning, such as practice development interventions and in case and clinical supervision to develop workforce knowledge and skills. And the fifth and final recommendation was for the Brighton and Hove Safeguarding Adults Board to seek assurance from relevant partners and evidence that mental capacity assessment training includes up-to-date guidance and relevant case law on, for example, the correct order of the stages of the assessment of mental capacity, and also on the importance of executive capacity. Thank you for watching this video and for your interest in this thematic review. You can find the full report on the Brighton and Hove Safeguarding Adults Board website, which also contains other useful information.